Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
I'm delighted to welcome to Louisville. You've been to Louisville, I'm sure, many times, right? To welcome back to Louisville, Michael Benson, who is currently president of Coastal Carolina University, and he was just telling me about their new library that they've built, which doesn't have any stacks, which on the one hand, I love books, right? On the other hand, you don't have to shelve anything. How awesome is that? And people can't move them out of the right place once you get them shelved. So I'm gonna do some research. I'm gonna look that up. He's a former president of a university much closer to home, Eastern Kentucky University, where he's president from 2013 to 2019. Has an undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University, and I guess this would be what, a DPhil? Is that what they called it? A DPhil from Oxford University, so they don't call it a PhD. But we are delighted to have President Dr. Benson with us tonight. Thank you very much for being here. Come tell us more about your book.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you so much for the invitation. I also want to mention the Kentucky Humanities folks, Bill, State Treasurer, and my very good friend, Tom Appleton. So many great memories of our time here. I'd be remiss, too, if I didn't thank Craig and Madonna Turner, my very good friends that we moved to Kentucky thanks to them. So Craig and Madonna, thank you all for being here. I hope tonight, every time I teach a class, and I teach one every academic year, I have a faculty appointment in history at Coastal Carolina, and you always assume that their students are going to be as interested in the topic as you are, and that's usually not the case. But tonight, I hope you feel the passion I have for this subject and for the incredible uniqueness that is the American Research University. And things that we have today in 2024 were established by this gentleman right here in 1876 when America saw for the first time ever a modern research university. So I hope tonight you'll come away and appreciate really the miracle that is the research university. And believe me, I've been in higher ed now for 30 years. We do a lot of dumb things. We do a lot of dumb things to ourselves. But the research university is the envy of all the world, and it's thanks to this gentleman right here, Daniel Coit Gilman. So as I mentioned, it's great to be back in Kentucky. This is the Crabb Library at EKU where I spent the COVID year writing this book, and that was my office. And you can see it's appropriately decorated with files and open books and everything else. But that's where I spent from January of 2020 until the end of that year writing this book. I tell students all the time, education can take you anywhere, and in point of fact, it's taken our family all over. I got my start at the University of Utah, beautiful member institution now of the AAU. Snow College, a two-year school in central Utah. From there, we went to high desert of Cedar City, Utah, at southern Utah. Our home there was at 6,000 feet elevation. Our home in Myrtle Beach is 9 feet elevation, so that's a really big, it's a pretty significant swing. Of course, our time at EKU, this is the Turner Gate. That brings back a lot of great memories. And now our campus in Conway, South Carolina. So we're about 10 miles due west of Myrtle Beach. As I mentioned, education can't take you anywhere. And I love this picture, and I'm going to tell you about it. This is my grandfather. My grandfather was born in Whitney, Idaho, a town of 40 people, oldest of 11 children, and the first to go to college. This is Dwight D. Eisenhower. From Denison, Texas, but grew up in Abilene, probably a town of 2,000, maybe 3,000 people. Fred Vinson, Chief Justice of the United States, Louisa, Kentucky, born in the jail. This is my grandfather being sworn in by Chief Justice Vinson to be the Secretary of Agriculture. And he did that for all 8 years for Eisenhower. And I show this picture to my students, and I say, it doesn't matter where you're from. Your town could be 20 people or 20,000. If you invest in yourself and in education, it can take you anywhere. So I have a lot to be thankful for, that my grandfather had the wisdom and temerity to go to college and did a degree at Iowa State in agricultural economics. When you see the outline of Kentucky, that's going to be a cue for you that I'm going to talk about a tie to either Gilman or to the Research University, and I hope it makes it a little more local and appropriate for you. We are in the shadow of a person that I would call the Dean of American Higher Education History, and that's John Thielen. He was very good to me as I launched my book. His book is now in the 3rd edition, is really kind of the standard, is it not, Tom, for any class on American higher education. And we both have published with Hopkins Press, so I have that one thing in common with him because he's a lot smarter than I am. But if you haven't had the chance, look on YouTube, his last lecture. It's really a superb 90-minute session of his kind of journey in life. I can't start this talk without talking about a remarkable family from Louisville, the Flexner family. 9 children, 7 boys. Of the 7 boys, these are 3 that I'll mention. Simon, who became the first director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medicine. His brother Bernard, who was an attorney. His papers are housed at Princeton University. And the one you probably know more about, and I know more about because he wrote a book about Gilman, Abraham Flexner. There was another Flexner brother, Jacob, who graduated from Louisville Medical School and practiced medicine here in this fair city for 4 decades. But I hope tonight you'll come away with even a greater appreciation for these remarkable people who are natives of your beautiful city. Simon Flexner had the good fortune and the good sense to hire this woman, and I'll talk about her later, Florence Rena Sabin, the first woman to become a department chair and the first elected to the National Academy of Sciences, who earned her medical degree at Hopkins. But he hired her as the first female researcher at the Rockefeller Institute. And again, I'll talk about her a little bit later. Of course, as I mentioned, Abraham Flexner wrote a book about Gilman and said this: he was the most effective educational advocate our country has ever produced. He comes by this opinion, I think, honestly. And he is a pretty good judge of character. His really seminal work was in 1910, Medical Education in the United States and Canada, considered in many ways the gold standard that changed the way we taught medicine, the way we practiced it, and the way that we established teaching hospitals. And I'll get into more history about that. He also did this 1946 biography of Gilman. It's about 120 pages, a breezy read, but that was the most contemporary book about Gilman. And that leads me into my conversation of how I got onto the subject, which I'll get to in a second. But back to Abraham, he was the first director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. So he was a pretty good judge of intellect, and this is one of the people he recruited, Mr. Einstein. And that's John Hardin, who was the first chair of the board of the IAAS at Princeton. I have enormous respect for him for a lot of reasons, but he always learned. He never forgot how important it was to keep your mind sharp and to pursue education. Here he is at 82 in class at Columbia University. And the New York Times wrote an article about here he was, a gentleman who helped direct $600 million for the Rockefeller Institute, but he was taking classes in European history and Soviet public administration. And he did that until he died when he was 85, I think 85 or 86 years old. Really a remarkable man. So what we'll do tonight, I'll talk about the uniqueness that is the American Research University, a bit about the background and training of Daniel Coit Gilman, elements of the Hopkins model which were entirely novel and wholly unique, the impact of that model on our system today, and then I'll be happy to take any questions and comments you might have. Clark Kerr, the first president of the University of California system, but also chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley. He said this about our system: the most effective system of higher education the world has ever known. I agree with that. We may have a lot of faults, but our higher education system is not one of them, because people come from all over the world to study here. Now, he said some other very profound things like this: the university is a series of individual entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance about parking. It doesn't matter where you are, and I've worked at universities across the country, parking, everybody wants a spot right in front of their destination, And we started school last Wednesday, and I've already fielded probably 10 calls from their parents because Johnny or Susie cannot find a parking place in front of their building. So anyway, that's an issue, but one that we happily deal with. I want you to think about two presidents from two different epochs of time and two different political parties. One is Abraham Lincoln, who just 10 weeks before the Battle of Antietam signed into law the Morrill Land-Grant Act. And the reason I'm using his example and also another one in just a second is that I often hear from legislators or legislatures, well, we can't invest in higher education right now because it's just too costly, and we have other priorities. So in the crucible of the bloodiest conflict we've ever seen as a country, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Land-Grant Act, which established state universities and colleges throughout our country. Fast forward a few decades, and another president from another party, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signs into law a mere 16 days after the invasion of Normandy, the GI Bill. If I were to ask you, how many of you either benefited from the GI Bill or had a family member benefit from the GI Bill, raise your hands. Look at that. That's over half the room. Yes, the Morrill Land-Grant Act established the institutions, but the GI Bill threw open those doors of the institutions to people that heretofore would not have had access to education, and that changed our country. So when we say, oh, we can't afford to invest in higher education, yes, we can. One did it during the Civil War. One did it during the greatest global conflict we've ever seen. How I got on this topic, I owe a lot to Jonathan Cole. He was 40 years at Columbia University. I had lunch with him just last year. Really delightful man. He's retired now, but this was the book that kind of set me on my course. It's a big tome. It's 1,000 pages. But he talks about what has emerged from our research universities that every single day impacts our life, that we probably take for granted. One of which is this laser beam I'm using right now, developed by a guy named Charlie Towns from Furman University, where he graduated at age 20, Caltech when he was 24, from Greenville, South Carolina. And he developed what they call the maser, that's what we know today as the laser. But take a look at some, I'm not going to go through here, but universities take kind of ownership, or they kind of claim responsibility, or take credit for a lot of these things. For example, origins of computers. Everybody wants to claim that one. Methods of surveying public opinion. University of Chicago, great in sociology, statistics. Look at that, where I got my start, the first human artificial heart transplant. GPS. How many of you use Waze to get here tonight? There you go. Right there. Gatorade. A professor in health sciences in the late 1960s goes out to watch one of the football team practice and recognizes that water just is not cutting it. They're not replenishing electrolytes. They're not getting the kind of the refurbishment they needed. So he develops a drink, names it for their mascot, and now they get about $220 million a year in royalties from Gatorade. So I know that because our new CFO came from the University of Florida. We live in beautiful South Carolina, but to our north is an example of a state that years and years ago decided to invest in this little triangle. What's it called? The Research Triangle. And think about all the companies that have spun off, all the dollars that are plowed back into the economy of North Carolina. We're in many ways a sister state to North Carolina. What is it? The people in Virginia, or excuse me, in North Carolina quote this often. North Carolina is the valley of humility in between the peaks of arrogance of South Carolina, Virginia. Whatever. But anyway, they remarkable institutions, and this is how much they do annually in sponsored research. So when I say that, it's how much the institution spends on investments in research and development, but also how much they attract from National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and other federal agencies. Now contrast that with what we do in South Carolina. We really have 3 research universities. The medical university is kind of tangentially associated with USC. But you can see we really pale in comparison to what happens in North Carolina. Now, is the quality of life in South Carolina as good as it is in parts of North Carolina? Probably not. And I would argue that much of that is because of the industry they've been able to attract, the jobs they've created, and what they're able to do because of the research that spins off from these three really remarkable institutions. Now, I learned in my time here in Kentucky, for a relatively small geographic state, yes, it's wide, but it's very narrow, kind of north to south. Look at how many institutions we have. Public, private, really remarkable places. This is how much the University of Louisville does annually in R&D. Almost $230 million. This is 2022 totals. University of Kentucky, almost $500 million. They're probably getting closer to that. Medical school, pharmacy school, even ag school helps them tremendously, just like a dentistry program and a medical school at U of L. So how did I get interested in this book? I read prior to my inaugural speech at Eastern Kentucky. I'd had two already, and as my kids would say, they were mid. They were okay, Dad, but you need to do better this time. So I decided to go and read what other people had said in their inaugural addresses. So the gem I found was Gilman's from 1876. And this is the one slide I'm going to read to you tonight because I think it's so incredibly powerful. But when he gave his address, he asked kind of this rhetorical question, what is the significance of all this activity? He cited all the fact that the islands of the sea and Africa and parts of Europe were looking to the United States for light as it related to what we were doing with higher education. Then he said, what is the significance of all this activity? And this is the one thing I'm going to read tonight, because I want you to think about how he framed in probably the most powerful and, to me, most meaningful way what all of us should aspire to do in higher education. It doesn't matter what kind of school you are. If you're a 2-year community college, a 4-year research university with a bunch of graduate programs, this is the standard, I believe, that we should all aspire to. Education, it should be a reaching out for a better state of society than now exists. It is a dim but indelible impression of the value of learning. It is a craving for intellectual and moral growth. It is a longing to interpret the laws of creation. It means a wish for less misery among the poor, less ignorance in schools, less bigotry in the temple, less suffering in the hospital, less fraud in business, less folly in politics. It means more study of nature, more love of art, more lessons from history, more security in property, more health in cities, more virtue in the country, more wisdom in legislation, more intelligence, more happiness, more religion. That is incredibly powerful, and he concludes his talk. By the way, he spoke for 90 minutes. So I was not about to speak for 90 minutes. Craig and Madonna would have walked out. But at the end of his talk, and this is back in the day when oratory was an art form, and people came to hear people speak, and he delivered. But he says at the end, Patapsco is a river, as you know, that runs through Baltimore. He says, we launch our bark upon the Patapsco and send it forth into unknown seas. No one had any idea what this guy was talking about. I mean, Johns Hopkins, yes, it started with a really generous gift, and I'll show you what the campus looked like, but no one had any idea what was going to happen to it. Would it develop into the institution that it is today? And the great virtue of Gilman was he was very powerful in his oratory, but his oratory led to actions, and actions produced results. And that's the key. So much so that when Hopkins turned 125 years old back in 2001, they went through his inaugural address, and they pulled out 12 kind of aspirational goals that he enunciated, that he elucidated. And they decided to create a coffee table book, beautiful book called Knowledge for the World. And this is the editor of that book. Her name was Mame Warren. And she said, President Gilman described this array of activities 125 years ago, and here we are today. We have virtually accomplished every single one. The one thing, and I gave a talk at Hopkins with the president there, he said the one thing we didn't do is we didn't create a law school. That's one thing he really wanted to see. No, we don't need more attorneys. That's okay. Sorry to the attorneys in the room. But this is really something. The fact that they accomplished all those things in 125 years. So, 2017, I went to visit Hopkins with a colleague from Eastern Kentucky. I wanted to go inside at Gilman Hall because I wanted to learn more about him. This student's kind of giving me an odd look because I'm taking pictures of everything as I'm in there, and this is the kind of vestibule as you walk into Gilman Hall. And the stained glass windows on that wall you can see right here, they're first Yale, where he went as an undergrad. This is the University of California, where he was the third president. This is Johns Hopkins, and this is the Carnegie Institution of Washington. So his wife paid for these beautiful windows after his death to kind of commemorate what he did. A bit about his background: born in Norwich to a family of means. One of, I think, he was right in the middle of 9 children. He graduated Yale in 1852. He spent a year studying institutions throughout Europe. He came back to Yale. He raised funds for the Sheffield Scientific School. Back in the 19th century, particularly Ivy League schools were very traditional. So you went to university to do one of 3 things: be an attorney, be a teacher, be a member of the clergy. So if they wanted to study scientific disciplines, chances are you had the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard, you had the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale, and they were kept apart from the main campus. He served as librarian of Yale. How about that? Librarian of Yale. He also taught geography, married his first wife. She died tragically, very, very young, age 29, in 1869. Served, as I mentioned, the third president of Cal and the first president of Johns Hopkins. Shortly after he graduated, he developed his mutton chop beard. My editor at Hopkins said there's a small animal that lives inside of here. But there was, that was very, very definitive. That was very kind of distinctive. Everyone knew him by that beard. And to this day, they celebrate Hopkins' anniversary as kind of celebration day on February the 22nd, which is the day he gave his commencement address. So the tide of Kentucky. These are 2 of his classmates. This one right here is William Preston Johnston, born in Louisville, Kentucky. This is Daniel Coit Gilman. This is Andrew Dixon White. So from 2 classes at Yale, 52 and 53, you had the first president of Tulane, the first president of Johns Hopkins, the first president of Cornell. Those are some high achievers there. But back to William Preston Johnston. His father was Albert Sidney Johnston. Those Civil War historians in the room, shot in the back of the leg at the Battle of Shiloh. He bled out in his boot. But he was born in Washington, Kentucky. He had several children, one of whom was born right here in Louisville, William Preston Johnston. Went to Centre College. I didn't know there was a Western Military Institute in Georgetown, but there was. He then matriculated to Yale. After he graduated in 1852, he came here and graduated law school in 1 year. Really a remarkable man. He was, before he was the president of Tulane, he was the 3rd president of what would then become Louisiana State University, but that's not what it was always called. So here's a little connection to to the Civil War. And that is that the first director of the Seminary of Learning and Military Academy was none other than William Tecumseh Sherman. So as I flew through Atlanta today, you can see up on the walls the Sherman's March to the Sea, not thought of very fondly in Atlanta. But as a kind of a reminder to his friends in Louisiana of who won the Civil War, this is the ROTC building in Baton Rouge. And these are cannons right out in front. And if you look closely, there's a plaque out in front of the cannons. These cannons fired at Fort Sumter and presented to the university by General William Tecumseh Sherman after the war. So that was the connection to William Preston Johnston and to Sherman. So Gilman really his dream job was to be the president of his alma mater. And you can see this quote here: a group of old men presided by old man chose the old way and an old professor. Noah Porter was considerably older, almost 2 decades older than Gilman. He was devastated by this. To make it even worse, his wife had died just a year before. So he decided to kind of throw himself into his work. But lo and behold, the University of California came calling. And talk about an errant judgment. They offered the job to George McClellan just a few years after he challenged Abraham Lincoln in the Republican primary in 1864. And the people of California said, look, Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president. Why would you do that? And so he backed out, They continued to pursue Gilman. The timing just was not right. A few years later, he finally kind of acquiesces and becomes the third president. He's named at age 41. This is right before he leaves for California. But during his tenure, he did some remarkable things. I want to especially bring your attention to this. They freely admitted female students. Not some, really the only schools that were doing that pre-Civil War and post-Civil War in this time period, Berea College, Cornell, Bryn Mawr was established as a way to admit women, but the University of California did, and you can see what he said. Among the regular students, the female scholars have been better students than the young men. And you can see the path that he put them on at the University of California. Here's the tie to Kentucky, which I find is really fascinating. He wanted to establish a law school, a pharmacy school, and a medical school. This is 1872. The University of California had only been established for about 5 years. 1868 was when it was founded. He knew all about Transylvania University, and the fact that it was established in 1799, the great majority, I don't want to say majority, but a lot of physicians that were practicing in America had graduated from Transy. It was closed in 1859, but before it closed, one of its graduates was a guy by the name of Hugh Toland. Hugh Toland was from Sumter, South Carolina, and he got caught up in the gold rush and moved his family from Columbia, South Carolina, to San Francisco, opened up his own practice as a surgeon. He said, it's more important for me to train doctors than it is to help patients. I'll do both. So he builds this beautiful Toland Medical College. And those of you who know San Francisco, on Stockton between Chestnut and Francisco, Gilman comes to him and says, Dr. Toland, we need to establish a medical school. We can't afford a facility. We want you to donate it to the University of California, your medical college. Toland kind of hemmed and hawed. He wanted his name to be affiliated with the college. He said, no, this belongs to the people of California, not to one individual. He persuaded him to do that, and lo and behold, this little medical college then became the University of California, San Francisco. And look at what they do now. It's the only university dedicated to health sciences solely. It did $1.8 billion in research and development. It's produced 7 Nobel laureates, and it has an $8 billion annual budget. All started by Hugh Toland, who agreed to give his medical college to the University of California. This gives you an idea of what I'm talking about when we talk about sponsored research. So this gives you the rank. Johns Hopkins has led the country in how much they spend on research for 44 years in a row. The reason I wanted to show this really quickly is there's a tie to football here, which we're kicking off here in just a few days. But look at this. Always number 2, usually number 2, is the University of California, San Francisco. $1.8 billion. Hopkins at $3.4 billion. So this is in millions. That gives you an idea of how much money we're talking about. My cousin has a son who plays offensive line for the University of Michigan. He is 6'7", 337 pounds. So this year, Washington played Michigan. And I would argue this will probably be the first and only time in the history of college football that 2 of the top 5 schools in terms of how much is spent on research and development will ever play for the national championship. UCLA is not very good. California, San Diego does not play football. Wisconsin, they're okay. But that was wholly unique. And look how much they spend annually in research and development, those 2 public institutions. Take a look at this list. This is the top 19. Look at how many are public. Public, 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 public. So it's not just private institutions that invest in the R&D. It's when state legislatures recognize that if they invest in those research dollars, they can be then monetized and the research can be applied, and there's a tremendous economic benefit. So Gilman is out at the University of California. He gets a telegram from his brother saying there's a gentleman by the name of Johns Hopkins who has just established a will in 1869 of $7 million, equal amounts for a hospital and for a university. And Gilman decides, I'm going to go take a trip out there and take a look at it. So he's in San Francisco. and it should say to California and to Baltimore. So he makes his first trip out to California in 1872. And this is back in the day when there is one line. If there's a problem that goes on with that one line, you're in trouble. From Denver all the way to San Francisco. But it was easier to go from New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. to Europe than it was to go from those points east to west. But he did it repeatedly. And I went through and I read the travel logs, and it was a good 10 days to, almost 2 weeks to get back and forth. So Hopkins has no heirs. He's not married. He is convinced by George Peabody that the way he can use his wealth is to invest in education and in healthcare. Does that sound familiar? And the equivalent today would probably be about $162 million. So George Peabody, this is the Peabody Institute, the library, one of the most beautiful libraries, I believe, in the world. He's known around the world for, he really built the first affordable public housing in England. And there's a beautiful statue of him in Washington Square in Baltimore. I took my son Samuel there to see it. This was just a few years ago. I said, Sam, take a look at this. And he goes, wow, what is that? I said, Sam, that's a card catalog. That's what we used to use. And he was so taken by it, he took a picture of the cards. He had no idea what a card catalog was. But Peabody and Hopkins merged a few years ago. And speaking of mergers and what impact this had, Hopkins makes his gift. He writes up the will in 1869. He dies on Christmas Eve in 1872. And what this does is it spurs other philanthropists to give to higher education, which nobody had been doing. And here's a good example of a few universities that just in the wake of this are established. Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1873. There was a university called Western Reserve that merged with Case Institute for Science in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1960s, but Case was established in 1880. This is Clark University, kind of modeled after the Hopkins model. You all know the University of Chicago. The Rockefellers gave all the money to start that. William Rainey Harper, the first president, he and Gilman were very good friends. Of course, the Stanfords, Leland and Jane Stanford, gave all the money and the property to establish Stanford in 1891 in memory of their son, who died of leukemia when he was 16. And they wanted to build a university to their son that had never had a chance to go to university. So think about that. The gift, yes, to Hopkins was significant, but it all of a sudden spurred all of these other donations to particularly, these are all private schools. So the trustees of Hopkins get together and they say, okay, who should be the first president? And they poll these three presidents. Robert Angell was the president of the University of Michigan for 40 years, probably only rivaled by Theodore Hesburgh at Notre Dame in terms of length of tenure. This is Andrew White of Cornell, and this is Charles Eliot. He was a very renowned chemist. He had a stroke, so he insisted on being photographed all the time from his left side because his right side, he could not use his right arm. Despite that hindrance, he was a remarkable scholar and a very good academician. During the whole debate about the Morrill Land Grant Act, there were three private institutions that got the land script from the Morrill Land Grant Act in the 1860s. One was Yale, and Gilman got it for Yale. The other one was Cornell. Dixon White got it from Cornell. The third private institution was MIT, because there was not a University of Massachusetts, Amherst, or anywhere else when the script was given. So Justin Morrill, I love this letter because he really wanted to come to Gilman's inauguration. Justin Morrill, the senator from Vermont, and he couldn't make it, so he wrote him this beautiful letter and said, I congratulate you upon reaching a position at last where you will have ample room for your laudable enthusiasm in behalf of higher education. I hope we all have laudable enthusiasm for higher education. So the primary purpose of the university that Gilman talked about was very simple. He said, obviously football didn't exist, climbing walls and rec centers didn't exist, kind of all the accoutrements that we associate now with higher ed didn't exist. So he said, if you distill down what we're about, it is the acquisition, the conservation, the refinement, the application of knowledge. That's what the university is for. And so what then were the Hopkins innovations? I couldn't resist. Was football one of them? No. But there's a really interesting tie to the oldest rivalry in the South. Hopkins is the best at lacrosse. Nobody will ever touch this record. 44 national championships in lacrosse. This is their lacrosse field that also doubles as a football stadium. So it's not Kroger Field. It's not the field here at Louisville. It's not even ours at Coastal Carolina. But the South's oldest rivalry was started by two gentlemen that earned their PhDs at Hopkins in the 1880s. One of whom was introduced to this thing called football by none other than Woodrow Wilson at the University of Virginia, where he went to school. The first was George Petrie. He was a historian. Any Auburn fans in here? He's the gentleman that wrote the Auburn Creed, which is a really beautiful kind of statement of what Auburn's all about. The other was Charles Hurdy, who was a chemist from the University of Georgia. So this is not kind of how teams look today, but they played the first game ever in Piedmont Park in 1892. And people paid 50 cents to watch this thing called football. No forward pass. This was a few years before there were some fatalities in football, and that's when Teddy Roosevelt got all the presidents together and said, you were going to change this game and we're going to ban it. And lo and behold, the NCAA started, and we are where we are today. So let me get back to the innovations, and I'm going to kind of wrap it up with this as we talk about some of the things that Hopkins did that nobody else had ever done. The first was that they were going to emphasize teaching, which was important, but the emphasis was really going to be on primary research. They were going to hire the very best scholars in their respective fields and give them the tools they needed to conduct research that nobody else had done. So you can see Gilman believed that really good teachers were ones that were also current in their discipline. And I believe that's true today. I always encourage our faculty, stay current in your academic area of specialty. He also put a big emphasis on men and not buildings. Don't believe, I hope you don't read more into that, but of course, the first employees were all men faculty. I'll talk about the lack of women in a second and why that happened. Certainly not excusable and it's not defensible. But all of the fellows that came to Hopkins had come from these beautiful bucolic places, the quads at Yale and the Gothic architecture at Princeton, the setting in Cornell and Ithaca, which is beautiful, and of course up there in New Hampshire, Dartmouth. And all of a sudden they move to Hopkins because they got fellowships. And where are they? They're in downtown Baltimore. This is the main science building. And the story goes that somebody would say, what is this that we're passing on the trolley? Well, that's a piano factory. No, that was actually the chemistry lab. Another said, look, they have all this millions of dollars for genuine research, but no money for show. And that was not important to Gilman. It was about men and not buildings. I'm going to go out and hire the best. So the element was, it was twofold. One was the emphasis on research the German way. And this is William Welch, who was the first dean of the medical school and the founder of the first school of public health at Hopkins. Talked about how you specialized. If you want to be a chemist, you be the very best chemist in physical chemistry or analytic, or if it's physics, what kind of physics it is. Whatever it is, you become expert in that particular area. And they based a lot of that model on Heidelberg. If you look at the physicians that were really good, and if you want to go get a PhD in the 19th century, mid-19th century, you didn't stay in America. You either went to England, or a lot of people went to Germany. Some would go to other parts in Europe, but they did not stay here. The second element, Jamie recognized that? My friend Jamie from Oxford, was the tutorial system. So you have the folks that are doing the research, the professors that are giving full-time attention to full-time students as full-time professors. This is Herbert Baxter Adams teaching this class right here. You can't read this quote, but the quote here is, this is a seminar in history. History is politics, history is past politics, and politics is present history. He became the founder of the American Historical Association. This is John Calvin Finch. He was the first Hopkins librarian. In the back of the hall is the four doctors. We'll get to them in a second. But there was this tremendous emphasis on these seminars where you really grilled your students, and it was based on the tutorial method from Oxford. Back to Kentucky. The original 6 faculty, take a look at this list. He went out and scoured the world for the best mathematicians, the best philologists. This was a classicist, Basil Gildersleeve. Biologist Henry Martin Newell. This was a gentleman from England who was a professor of Greek and Latin. This was Ira Remsen, who was Gilman's successor as president. Look at how young they were. The first faculty member, female faculty member, was Dr. Sabin, and I'll get to her in a second. Here's the tie to Kentucky. So of the first group of fellowships, so I talked about how he offered fellowships at the University of California, but they kind of ran out of funding. Gilman made the case to the board, if you're going to invest in recruiting the best talent, that's how we're going to separate ourselves. That's how we're going to distinguish ourselves from everybody else. Nobody could afford $500 fellowships to graduate students. Hopkins was the first to do it. So who did they get? They got people like John Dewey, who started the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, Craig and Madonna, that based on that model became the model laboratory school at EKU, founded in 1906, the only one left in the state of Kentucky. Woodrow Wilson had come from the University of Virginia. Thomas Hunt Morgan, you all recognize that name? Evolutionary biologist from Lexington and a University of Kentucky graduate. Innovation number 2, his famous quote was that it's the noblest duty of the university not just to deliver the lecture to the people that can attend the class, but far and wide. And how do you do that? You did that in the form of journals. You did that in the form of a university press. You did that in the form of Project Muse. You have Project Muse here at the library? We do it at most universities. A lot of public libraries don't. But a public university library, private, will all have access to Muse. A really interesting connection, too, to the press ties to the University Press of Kentucky. And we talked about that earlier today, Bill. This is Hopkins Fulfillment Services. So this was founded in 1977, and basically they're all the back-of-house services for presses. They do the order fulfillment, they do the warehousing, they do the sales, they do the shipping. So if you order a book from the University Press of Kentucky, chances are it's going to come from Baltimore, Maryland. And these are all the members of the University Press of Kentucky. I hold it up as one of the great examples of collaboration in a state this size, where you have all of these universities, colleges, and also the Filson Historical Society. And these are the universities that associate with Hopkins distribution, and you can see all the different presses, including University Press of Kentucky. So the research that gets done, it gets published by the University Press of Kentucky, is distributed by Hopkins Press, which was founded in 1878. I mentioned how they attracted the best fellows into the university. You can see what they did the first few years. This quote from Flexner, in a single bound, with the lure of $500, which paid for everything, housing, room and board, they didn't have to worry. You know, if I'm John Hunt Morgan, I'm going to go focus on my evolutionary biology and not have to worry about where I live or how I'm going to eat. And in one single bound, they outstripped everybody. That's a great quote from Flexner. Another thing that they did, which I thought was really unique, is that if they had fellowships in areas that they didn't have tenure faculty or full-time faculty, they went out and got people that would come and spend 2-3 years in political science, engineering, and philosophy. Then as the enrollments grew, they can make the case that we need to go hire a full-time faculty member in that particular discipline. And that really helped fill the void with visiting faculty for many, many years. Look at this first group of fellows. This is just a very, very, as I said, it was how many in the first year? 54. This is a really small number. Henry Carter Adams, arguably the greatest political economist we had in the 19th century. Herbert Baxter Adams, I mentioned him. Joshua Walker Gore. Walter Hines Page, he was a publisher, later the U.S. ambassador to England. So there was this amazing concentration of talent, of acumen, of experience in Baltimore that literally just ascended in the space of just a few years. How many PhDs do we have in the room? Okay. You all went through a really rigorous program to get your PhD. Chances are these requirements were all established in 1877 1876, the first graduates graduated in 1878, 79. Use of external examiners, the space between when you get your bachelor's degree and when you start your doctoral program. Sometimes you skip a master's, as I did. Sometimes you did not. The publication of dissertations or theses. John Dewey shows up to do a PhD in philosophy and writes his dissertation on Immanuel Kant. And it gets lost. Nobody can find it. And Gilman says, this is never going to happen again. We're going to publish every dissertation. We're going to make 100 copies, and we're going to send it to every university library that wants it. So this began the interlibrary loan, if you will, in the 1870s. So all of these things, this is just a short list, but when the AAU was founded, and Gilman was one of the 5 founding members of the AAU, they adopted these PhD requirements as the de rigueur, as the de facto, rather, practice for achieving a doctorate. Look at how many doctorates they produced. Okay, from 1876 to 1902, Harvard had a 240-year head start on Johns Hopkins. They produced 320. That same time period, 26, 27 years, Hopkins produced almost 600 PhDs. And it's not that they were easy. On the contrary, they were very rigorous. And President Eliot said it wasn't until we followed the example of Hopkins that we really got with it. Think of all the graduate degrees that Harvard produces now. The PhDs, the MDs, the JDs, the master's programs. And there's a shot of President Gilman, of President Eliot. How about Hopkins Hospital and the School of Medicine? This is if you've ever been to Baltimore, it's apart from the Homewood campus. The design of it, you can see with the beautiful basilica. I'll get to the architect in a second. His name was John Neardsey. He designed the state capitol in South Carolina, which is a beautiful building. His portrait's there on the wall inside the Capitol. The construction of the State House was suspended during the Civil War, but he also was hired to do Hopkins Hospital. This is the station, Camden Station in downtown Baltimore. He worked with a guy named John Shaw Billings, who was a field surgeon that after the Civil War put together the U.S. Surgeon General's medical library. He was a master organizer. He just had this really unique talent of putting things together. During the Civil War, as I mentioned, he was a field surgeon. This is as he starts the conflict after the battles of Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness. This is what he looked like. So you can imagine the toll it took on him. He is discharged from the Army, becomes the head of the U.S. Surgeon General's office, and comes up with this really unique design of what the hospital should look like. He had a main building, and then he had this proposal that buildings should be built based on what they were for. A surgery building, acute care building. And that over time, because germs would accumulate and people didn't understand how pathogens were transmitted, they would tear down the building and rebuild a new one right on site. They obviously modified, but one thing that Gilman did is he went out and hired the best 4 doctors he could find in 4 specific disciplines. First is William Welch. I mentioned him. He was a pathologist. William Stewart Halstead, I'll talk about him. He was a surgeon. Sir William Osler, he was an internist, British. He's the Radcliffe camera there in Oxford. And Howard Kelly, who was a gynecologist. This portrait, you know who John Singer Sargent is, the portrait, the painter? These 4 doctors sailed across the Atlantic to sit in his studio in London for this portrait. He did everyone from Teddy Roosevelt to, you name, kind of luminaries in the 19th and 20th centuries, and chances are John Singer Sargent painted them. I wanted to just talk about one of them, just this gentleman right here, William Stewart Halstead. He was a surgeon. He had a terrible addiction. He was introduced to cocaine as a local anesthetic for eye surgery. When he went to a lecture in Germany, he decided to try it back in the United States, and he got addicted to cocaine. So did many of his residents. They tried to wean him off cocaine with morphine. So for 30 years, he was in effect a drug addict, but did these amazing things as a working addict. Invented the traction for neck fractures. He had also invented with Welch the practice of grand rounds. And grand rounds, at the foot of the bed, you have a chart, but nobody ever recorded the temperature. They didn't think that was important. He did. He preferred, how about this? He did a first emergency blood transfusion on his sister who was dying in childbirth, and then took out his mother's gallstone on the kitchen table and saved her life. He was dating a woman who was Wade Hampton's granddaughter. She was a nurse in his surgical lab, in his surgical suite, and he insisted on cleanliness. They had to literally wash in and scrub in with almost like this acid. And over time, it would wear away the skin of the nurses. And this woman, her name was Carolyn Hampton, she said, look, if you want me to be your nurse anymore, you've got to come up with something else. So he said, all right, finish the surgery, and I'll figure out something. He marches out of the surgical suite, goes to Goodyear Tire and Rubber down the street, and has them develop a set of rubber gloves. And they've obviously perfected it over time, but he was the first to promote clean surgery. He was not a big believer that you get in there and you take your time. He got in, he got it done, and got him sewn back up. That was the school of surgery that he really emphasized. Cinemax did a story about him, a series on him called The Nick, based on his character several years ago. I just finished this book called Genius on the Edge, this medical doctor in New York who argues what a remarkable career he had, but imagine what he could have done had he not been addicted to morphine and cocaine. It's rare I use an obituary in a lecture, but I read this from the Baltimore Sun right after he died. Look at this first paragraph. Because William Halstead lived, the world is a better, a safer, a happier place in which to be. He was one of the few men who really count. And he talks, this is 1922, they said nobody really fully appreciates what he did for medicine, but they will. And lo and behold, they have. A remarkable man. I encourage you to read more about him. Before we get to Innovation 6, and I'm in the home stretch here, it's not all, as they say, unicorns and rainbows for Johns Hopkins. They had some misses, and I'm going to touch on two of them that are pretty significant. Now, when you see that number of sponsored research, a lot of that research comes through this. This is the Applied Physics Lab outside of Baltimore there in northern Maryland. Southern Maryland, and a ton of money comes through that kind of sponsor projects entity. This is the Friday evening group, and why this is significant, this is Mary Elizabeth Garrett. Her father was a guy named John Wirt Garrett, who was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was also a named trustee at Johns Hopkins, as were the fathers of Mary Thomas, Mamie Gwynn, and Elizabeth King. Julia Rogers was the only one out of this group of five who did not have a dad on the board of trustees. And they would go to their fathers and say, Dad, why can't I go to Johns Hopkins? And the board said, no, we're not going to do that. This is for men, and we'll establish or we'll support kind of Hopkins Light is what it became known as Bryn Mawr, where it was an all-women's school where they could go. But she was a woman of means, thanks to what she inherited. She was very, very smart. And she approached Gilman and said, okay, I know you want to start a medical school because the hospital had been open since 1889. She said, if you do that, I'll give you the money to help start it, but you've got to admit women on the same footing as men. And the trustees agreed. And this is the first graduating class of 1897. And you see a female in there? All males, even have Dr. Welch's dog. But Mary Packard was not included in the picture, but she did graduate as the first female in 1897. Had gone to Vassar, really a remarkable career in medicine. This is Florence Sabin. So I mentioned her at the beginning. Remarkable woman. Finishes her degree in 1900. She becomes the first woman in America to hold a full professorship in 1917 at Hopkins. First woman elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and the first to head a department at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research as a female, hired by Simon Flexner. And how many statues do you get in Statuary Hall per state? 2. Colorado gets 2 like everybody else, and one of them is for Florence Sabin. And not too many people know about Florence Sabin. but I encourage you to do a little more research on her too. First female students ever admitted at Hopkins, they had to wait until 1870, and they graduated in 1974. Same can be said for African American students. The very first one that was admitted was this brilliant man. He was called the Bard of the Potomac, even though he was a brilliant astronomer and a mathematician. His name was Kelly Miller. He came on a fellowship. His money ran out. I did my best to try and find either board minutes or letters back and forth between Gilman and others about Kelly Miller, but I firmly believe that if they wanted to keep him, they could have done it. They could have found some money to apply to his fellowship. He ended up leaving. He went back to Washington, D.C., where he's from, and became dean of Howard University's College of Arts and Sciences, and was a sociology professor there for nearly 40 years. The very first African-American student, as an undergrad, male, called the day he graduated from high school, Frederick Douglass High School, and asked the admissions office, do you let in people like me in your school? And the answer on the phone is, well, no one's ever applied before. We said, well, I want to apply. And he was admitted the next day and started school the next day. And he graduated in 1950 in chemical engineering and had a very successful 40-year career serving as editor of the American Laboratory Journal. Died just a few years ago. I've watched an interview with him, a remarkable man. So those were some significant misses. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything because I put this in at this part of the presentation because I always like to say, think of all the ways that Hopkins was a leader, all the ways that they innovated. And think, Maryland was a border state, and the Civil War was still very much alive when Hopkins was established. What if they had admitted African-American students, female students? What would have happened? History is always a series of what-ifs, but I think of that often. To wrap up here, I mentioned 44 years in a row, $3.4 billion in fiscal year that they spent. That is just a tremendous amount of investment in things that, you've seen that before, that list before. So, to conclude, $7 million is invested in 1869. Today, I went back and looked at their audited financial statements, inclusive of their endowment and their capital, $20 billion enterprise. It's a pretty good return on investment, isn't it? 4 current faculty are Nobel laureates. 29 associated with the university have won the Nobel Prize. And if you paid attention to the news, one of their most famous graduates, Michael Bloomberg, announced a $1 billion donation that's going to pay for the medical education of any medical student whose family income is $300,000 or less. And by the way, that's 95% of all Americans. So they are going to graduate Hopkins debt-free. And he did the same thing for Howard University Medical School, and I think it's McClary in Tennessee. Meharry, thank you, Meharry. So Gilman retires in 1901, and this is where we'll wrap it up. And you look at the influence of Hopkins that is far out of proportion in terms of its size, its wealth, or its age. A good quote that tells you this. This psychologist decided to do a kind of a survey of 1,000 scientists in America. This is in 1926, 27. Of the 1,000 distinguished American scientists, 243 had graduated Hopkins. Now, a quarter of that, that's a big number. But think about all those fellowships that they got, and then these people came and they talked about their experience and they went back and recruited. So when Gilman retires, they present him with this beautiful book. And I know this sounds corny, but as a historian, I love stuff like this. It's this gilded book, gold leaf, leather bound, and you can see the calligraphy, the speech of Woodrow Wilson. He's designated as the speaker to represent all the students. And the university sent out an invitation to every alumnus they could track down. This is probably the first direct mail campaign the university had ever done in 1900. Asking for a current address. And what happened is each one of these graduates, over 1,200, sent a card with the year they graduated, what they were doing, and the institution they're associated with. And every one is placed in the back of this book. So you take a look at it. Here's Josiah Royce, for example. PhD in 1878, professor of history of philosophy at Harvard. Okay? Here's John Dewey, PhD 1884, professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. And it's page after page of these graduates that have come through Hopkins. And in my book, I detail how overcome Gilman was when he saw this. Because a lot of these men he helped recruit. You know, he knew them. He taught classes. And he knew that they were changing higher education in our country. Edward Shills at the University of Chicago said this. He believed that the establishment of Hopkins was the most decisive event in the history of the learning in the Western Hemisphere. I used that at Hopkins, and President Daniels said, that's a little hyperbolic, I think. But I would agree. I mean, a remarkable place started by a remarkable president. His last assignment, up until he died in 1908, he was recruited by Andrew Carnegie himself to head the Carnegie Institution of Washington that eventually became the Carnegie Institute of the United States. Some of the original board members, there's Samuel Langley, beat out by the Wright brothers on how to fly an airplane. You remember his story? John Hay, whose father was a doctor in Lexington, Kentucky, and moved his family to Indiana because he didn't like slavery. Here's Daniel Coit Gilman right here. And there is Andrew Carnegie. So I know the Carnegie Library is thanks to the beneficence of Andrew Carnegie, who built over, I want to say, 1,400 libraries in the United States and Canada. Probably the greatest philanthropist of the 19th and 20th centuries. So there you have it. There is Daniel Coit Gilman in a nutshell. I hope you learned something tonight, and we have a few more minutes, so thank you. Again, my assumption that you would find this as interesting as I do, I hope that was borne out. But a remarkable man with some really interesting ties to Kentucky as well. Any questions at all? I have one. Yes, sir. I think they want you to speak into the microphone, so here, I'll bring it to you. Yep. I feel like Phil Donahue. Do you have questions? There you go.
You mentioned earlier there was a quote in there that said to the effect of men, not buildings, or men, not...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think everybody understands what you meant by that. Today we have a system where buildings and football and sports and all the other activities seem to have overtaken the public or the educational mission.
Yeah.
So recently I heard where there's a question being raised today that the price of higher education has gotten so expensive. A lot of people are considering bypassing it to go into the whatever life work they want because they can't afford education. Mm-hmm. And I wonder in view of that, what do you think is the future of all this? I mean, sports alone has just taken the university system off its course of education, seems to be.
Well, I think
that going?
That's an excellent point, and I couldn't agree more. And believe me, I love football as much as anybody. We opened the season on Thursday night in Alabama. I guess that's where I'm going tomorrow. But that said, I was on a podcast the other day, and the question was, what would Gilman think of the American university today? And the emphasis on everything but what he talked about. I said, well, I think he would be sorely disappointed. I think the one thing he would be pleased with is the access to education that is provided through online programs. I did an online degree at Hopkins in liberal arts, and that was my favorite degree. I have 4 degrees, and by far that was my favorite, because I got to take all the classes I wanted to take, but I did it in an online setting that was really superbly done. Now, would he recognize all the stuff, all the kind of bells and whistles that campuses insist they need now to retain students? No. No, he was not one to coddle anybody. He wanted the best. He wanted to hold them to a very high standard, and he knew that that would produce results. So I don't know if I have an answer for you, because I've been in an industry that has continued to evolve, where we're getting farther and farther away from the aspirational goals that he talked about, which has made our system the greatest in the world. So I'll end with this, in an editorial comment. You know, you talk about the transfer portal, NIL, all the mess that is intercollegiate athletics today. The NCAA used to talk about what they called the GSR, graduation success rate, which was progress toward a degree. Nobody talks about that anymore. It's about, well, when can I get in the portal and how much money can I get? And in many ways, we've lost our soul.
European universities are basically building sets of buildings, and where they go to school, there's no campus, mostly there's no campus, I'm sure there are, but a lot of them don't have that, all the infrastructure
right.
we have today to provide it.
Yeah, I mean, having gone to Oxford, which I loved, my friend Jamie is here. The colleges make up the university, for example, and you live there, and that's your family, and that's your home. But there's not a big student union. They don't have a lazy river around a dormitory. For one thing, it'd be too cold in March to go on the lazy river. But the big sports there are what? Crew, rugby, and fencing. Well, not fencing, but dart. Yeah. So, where do we go from here? I don't know. I think I try and make a case all the time to legislators that will listen, regardless of where you are, is an investment particularly in the research component of a university. Because it's not just the research, it's the undergraduates that participate in research. That if they want to go to graduate school, that is going to set them apart from other applicants in whatever area they choose to do. So I really believe the future of our country in so many ways is tied to the research that comes out of university campuses and that can be applied. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you ended up covering a lot of it. My name's Christine Eric. I'm the chair of the history department at U of L. So,
all right.
University. So, right. A lot of what you talked about were private universities, but you mentioned the University of California, a system that I know very well. And one of the things I always want to point out is when people observe, like, quote unquote, how expensive college has gotten, part of what's happened is the dramatic shift of the cost of attending college away from tax, state appropriations to the actual attendees. So, for example, University of Louisville, as recently as 1979, the statistics that we had found, roughly 56% of its operating costs came from state appropriations. As of last year, that number was 9%.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that has happened. And then some of, I think, what that has rolled into, the lazy river phenomenon and all of those, because there has to be a justification for the kind of cost that parents and students are expected to shell out. So I just think, and that's connected to all these research questions. But I always feel it's important to point that out because people don't always understand what has changed so dramatically in the last half century. So that it's more of a comment than a question, I suppose. But if you had anything you wanted to add to that,
no. The subtitle to that Jonathan Cole book, which I highly recommend, is "The Great American University: Why It Should Be Supported and Maintained, or supported and promoted." Because his point in the book is states used to recognize the value of investing, in particularly in state systems. The University of California is arguably the greatest state system in this country. Cal Berkeley's produced more Nobel laureates in physics and chemistry probably than anyplace else. But the diminution of state dollars has now resulted in putting that burden on students, on parents. They take out loans, Stafford loans or Pell Grants, which are grants. But yes, it doesn't excuse our state legislatures at all, because that continues to be the case. At a place like Coastal, we're the third biggest institution in the state of South Carolina behind USC and Clemson. But we get we get 19% of our budget from the state. So what does that mean? We're reliant on auxiliary revenue in the form of residence halls and dining. We're in private gifts, parking. Although our parking rates are really reasonable. But, the overhead that you charge on a grant, that sort of thing. But you're exactly right. We need to kind of come back to state investment. Yes?
I was graduated from Hopkins undergraduate in the class of 73.
Oh, wow.
But I was there in 1970, and I have just two quick comments and then a question for you. But I remember when the Board of Trustees voted to allow women in 1970, the student newspaper had the edition came out after that decision. There was a headline across the paper that, like, these huge letters, it just said, next year, women, in great big print. So that was quite a major factor there. But one thing that was another big milestone when I was at Hopkins, and I was always told this, I'm not sure if it was true, but that in 1969, my freshman year, was the first time there were more undergraduates than graduate students on the campus.
You're correct. Yeah.
And that really affected the whole atmosphere. And I loved my time at Hopkins.
Yeah.
But I think that really your point about not being coddled,
Yeah.
that was definitely the atmosphere at Hopkins.
Yeah.
You were expected to be a research person when you went there. But the question I had for you was just going back to your comment about Bloomberg. I mean, my understanding is he's given $3 billion over the last 20, 25 years. And just kind of how that money was used, and is it being used to further the mission of the university and really kind of be true to the original mission of the university in using that money?
Yeah. So let me make one comment about what you said about undergrads. Because when Hopkins was first established, it was all graduate students. So the gift that Hopkins himself made, the $3.5 million to the university, was basically cash. The $3.5 million he gave to the hospital and the medical school was in the form of B&O stock, and it continued to devalue. So the board had to make a decision. The only way we're going to be able to afford to do this is to start bringing undergraduates in and have them pay tuition. So over time, they finally kind of caught up, and in 1969, they finally eclipsed the number of graduate students. I did an article for Inside Higher Ed because I was reading some of the criticism of Bloomberg when he first made his big gift, which was $2.5 billion, but all for financial aid. So if you were smart enough and ready to get into Hopkins, nobody paid tuition. And people were saying, oh, well, he could have done this, he could have done that. I said, look, it's his money, he earned it. He's channeling his inner Johns Hopkins right now, many, many years later, and now to do it for medical education. I commend him for doing that. He certainly has the wherewithal to do it, but his big point is the lack of access to really good medical school education. And now that people can go and not have to worry about tuition or graduating with $250,000 in debt, I think that's a very laudable thing that he's doing. So you're right. In the aggregate, somebody told me it's about $4.5 billion he's given, which is the biggest donation from anybody to any institution in our nation's history. Yes?
Hello.
Hi.
So this is a little bit separate from the higher ed portion. I'm a native San Franciscan. I was literally born at the University of California, San Francisco. So this feels a little bit personal to me. I graduated from the University of Hawaii and also worked in fundraising for the Kansas State University, so land grant university.
Sure, yeah.
Being a native San Franciscan, I did notice the name Coit in the presentation sprinkled throughout. So I'm wondering if that was the link for him in California with the Coit family, or is that just a separate altogether?
I did my level best on Ancestry.com to find some connection. And the Coit Tower, obviously in San Francisco, everybody knows that, but there's no connection. Gilman had a very interesting family. His dad was a mercantilist, very, pretty well off in Norwich. He had a brother that did a hard time in Sing Sing for embezzlement. He had an older brother, Edward, who was in the clergy. He had one of his sisters, when his first wife died, Louisa lived with them and really raised the kids. And then his two daughters, one ran, I think, 6 or 7 times as a socialist, from everything from the police chief of Baltimore to the governor of the state of Maryland, and never won, but she was a remarkable woman. Her name was Elizabeth Gilman. And a lot of people said she, in many ways, embodied kind of her father's, he was a devout kind of believer, not going to church every Sunday, but he really kind of lived his life in a way that he hoped was emblematic of what he believed. Treat others with respect, kind of novel things in today's world. Things like that. So they say that she really represented her dad in so many ways. You should look her up. A guy that worked at Hopkins, he was like the VP for University Relations, wrote a biography of her. Yeah. That's cool you were born at the hospital. That's pretty neat. Yes, sir.
Yeah. In a funny way, I guess, I was born in Little Rock, and I had an uncle who was a Hopkins man. And on the side of his desk was an image of Osler.
Yeah.
To understand later that I'd be up at Waterloo and inside the Environment Building was a man by the name of Isaiah Bowman, who was from Waterloo region.
Yep.
And I read your book, and trying to unpack that, I'm curious about the ability of historians to go back and rewrite history as the truths emerge really about data. He, as a geographer, would write about Machu Picchu, but he didn't quite tell the whole truth.
Yeah.
And when something happens in higher ed, or you start seeing the information needing to be truth to a higher plane, how do you see higher education being interested more in holding the land in place, or is it to hold and sustain and open up the minds for learning to learn? Because the land and what's going on, to me at least right now in the real estate, it's crazy that it costs more for a parent to pay for housing rather than having a relaxed community that understands where's the boundary of the clinic. And to do this better, I was curious as to how you perceive education changing at the speed when so much might be maintained in your cell phone.
Yeah. No, I use the example oftentimes that when Apollo 13 went in space, the computers they used in my phone, on my iPhone 14, I've got more computing power than they had. So, technology continues to advance at a rapid rate that obviously no one anticipated. If I understand your question, though, how does higher education help kind of inform society and do the honest research and address facts that at times are uncomfortable? In the book I found things, as I did my research, there were things that were not very flattering. And, every institution is trying to own up to some of its, as they call it, hard histories. There's a professor at Hopkins now doing these hard histories. Did Johns Hopkins have enslaved people in his household? The records show that he probably did. But he was a kind of ardent abolitionist and a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. But some people have used that as a way to kind of mask what happened. And I think historians especially have to, as you go through archives and you uncover things, you got to own up to everybody has to own up to it. Now, I say it in the preface. When I was doing my book on Harry Truman, I interviewed David McCullough, and he had won the Pulitzer that same year. Then my brother won a Pulitzer for political cartooning. So that was kind of a neat connection. I went out to Martha's Vineyard, and he said, the danger with academic historians is they tend to suck the warm blood out of their subject matter. And write in a very kind of two-dimensional sort of way. So as I got into this book and I read the letters, in so many ways the characters sprung to life for me. I know that sounds kind of geeky, but you'd go right and you'd read these letterpress books. And this is back in the day when people spent days with these beautiful salutations and beautiful penmanship with a dip pen. And you could sense the feeling that they had. And some of those feelings were raw, and I try to address it pretty clearly in my book. But that's a good question. I don't know if I gave you a proper response, but education it behooves all of us to make sure we do report everything, and we trying our best to cover everything as uncomfortable as it might be. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I'm a big supporter of regional institutions
Yep.
and, pushing research not just at RO1s.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to let you know that I recognize it, and I'm sure you do too, but in your era at EKU, the first female patent for research was ever filed.
Yep, cancer drug, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you. Yeah, research, it's not limited to R1s. Please don't misunderstand. We have a very good marine science program with a few patents by a professor that has chosen to spend his whole career at Coastal Carolina. Why? Because we're on the coast. Makes sense. And there's money to be had in terms of sponsored research. Yes, Bill?
I used to teach at a good public university that lost a young president one time. I think because there's too much politics in maybe all forms of education, but public education higher education has become terribly politicized in this state. And I think that's true of all the public institutions that I know of, including the largest of the institutions. And what I worry about is that as more and more smaller schools are inundated with debt, public and private, that we may end up with just a few large universities, and they will have branches, and we'll lose a lot of the diversity that we've had in higher education.
That's a very good point. I always like to go and look at the roster of faculty and where they did the graduate degrees, because I believe diversity of experience is really important. And if you follow this whole FAFSA mess where the federal government in all of its wisdom decided to roll out this new system and it wasn't ready, and the back of house stuff was not ready, and as a result, the school just to our kind of south and west, Birmingham Southern, they ran into such a problem in awarding financial aid. Now this had been accumulated for a few years, but the death knell for them was the FAFSA mess, and they closed their doors. And this, I think you're going to see more of that. It's kind of like the mega conferences in athletics. Is there a role anymore for the FCS schools, or is everybody going to be part of this mega conference? And it's not good. I mean, you look at Kentucky. That picture of all the schools in this state. Think about what they do for each one of those communities. Okay, in Danville, what does a Center College do for Danville? What does an EKU do for Richmond? What about Moorhead? What would Moorhead be without Moorhead State? And it's really, really important to have, I think, those diversity of experiences and institutions. So thank you, Bill. All right, last one. Yes, sir.
Last question.
I thought it was pretty interesting when you see the evolution from not allowing women in the university to now. There was a report on NPR that universities are having trouble attracting boys.
Yes.
Men. In fact, I think they said University of Montana is offering a class in hunting to try to get boys to come. And I thought that was a pretty interesting dynamic that now I'm in agriculture, and we are seeing many, many more women rise to the ranks in agriculture and taking significant positions. And I just thought that was an interesting transition.
So our female to male ratio is 58-42. And that's not dissimilar. I mean, you're seeing 2/3, if not higher, female populations. And I don't mean to be sexist in any way, but when I go to Honor Society inductions, whether it's we don't have a Phi Beta Kappa chapter, we're trying to get one, but Phi Kappa Phi or ODK, 75% are females. Our male students they're too distracted, and I say that as a father of a 17-year-old who it is a heavy lift every day to try to get him to focus on English 110. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.